So continuing our series on Rebbe Nachman's Outpouring of the Soul, chapter 13 on attachment. Now, attachment in the Jewish mystical tradition is not the same as attachment in the Buddhist tradition. Attachment in Jewish mysticism is good because attachment is always attachment to God. It is sometimes translated as clinging or closeness, cleaving. It's as close as a body in its shadow, as close as the dreamer in the dream, as close as the breath is to our body. Reb Nachman says the main concept of prayer is attachment to God. Because of this, in many ways, it would be better even to worship in the vernacular. When one prays in the language that he commonly speaks, his heart is very close to the words of the prayer and can be attached to the words. Through this, one would be able to attach himself even more closely to God. Now, most of us who don't belong to any kind of extremely orthodox tradition don't usually even have the experience of praying in a language that's other than our own. I suppose if you go to certain Zen monasteries, you'll chant, instead of chanting the Heart Sutra as we do, Avalokiteshvara, the Bodhisattva of Compassion, you say, Kanji Zai Bo Zai Go Jen Hanya Harami Daiji Shogen Gong. You'd be chanting in sort of a Sino-Japanese, a language other than your own. And certain mantras like Om Mani Padme Hum is actually not a language that we speak every day. Mantras are very short. We have a sense of what they mean or the state of mind that they call us to, so it's a little different. But Reb Nachman says that in our daily prayer, that if we use the language that we ordinarily use, we will find ourselves in that language, and in finding ourselves in that language and offering it to God, we will find ourselves close to God, being drawn closer to God. Now, let me back up for a moment and say that when we speak of God in this group, we're not talking about the God of religion. I mean, we don't discount the God of religion, but we're bound to no particular idea of who or what God is. When we use the word God, we refer to that which gives rise to life, sustains our life, and into which our life pours back at death. When we speak of God, sometimes we speak in such a way that it could be synonymous with the planetary ecosystem or the cosmos. We don't draw any distinction between the physical matter of our bodies and God. Sometimes I think of it this way. If you have a glove and you just drop it someplace, it's inanimate. It has a kind of a shape, but no vitality and no force, no life, no movement. The moment you slip your hand inside of it, however, it becomes indistinguishable from the hand that fills it. And so the spirit of life that animates matter and which assumes the shape of matter, that life force itself is what we refer to when we speak of God. Now, practically speaking, what does this mean? What does this mean in meditation? What does it mean in prayer? Well, if you have a meditation practice, like for instance Zazen, a practice of calming and stilling your mind, or perhaps the Tibetan Buddhist equivalent of that practice, something like Mahamudra or Dzogchen, or mindfulness meditation, one of the many other forms of meditation, everything from TM and breath counting to whatever the Vedantic equivalent of that would be. If you have any of these practices, then at one time or another, thoughts are going to be passing through your mind. The thoughts that pass through our minds naturally, without any modification, are our vernacular speech. They're the language we actually think in, and actually listen in, and actually speak in to ourselves. That is our vernacular. The language of piety and the language of philosophy and the language of religion, the language that we take in through sacred texts, the language that tells us to think in a certain way, to feel a certain way, to act in a certain way. This is a formal language which lies at a greater remove from our own, from the pulse of our own spiritual life. And to the degree to which we plop ourselves down and begin to meditate and to have pious or holy or enlightened thoughts, the more enlightened, the more holier, and the more pious those thoughts are, the further, ironically, they are from God. God doesn't seem to be particularly interested in piety. Piety is not holiness. Holiness is natural. Holiness is vernacular. Holiness is what we actually think and feel and speak within ourselves. That itself is holy. It doesn't have to be modified in any particular way. Trouble occurs when we diverge from that or divert from it. Trouble actually usually occurs when we begin to try to bring ourselves back more in line with what we imagine to be the way we should feel, the way we ought to behave, ought to act, ought to be. So when Rebbe Nachman talks about this clinging to God, it's not a chasing after God or a chasing after that holiness. It's not a finding it out there or grasping what Buddhists would call attachment. Rather, it's an inner grasping, like a hand reaching up inside a glove, which then takes its shape and moves perfectly with it, just as a shadow makes the exact same movements that the body makes. And that's the teaching.